The betrayal in Julian Ha-jun's empire didn't just bleed his pockets. It reached into his chest and tore out the last shred of his resolve. Beneath the ragged skyline of a city that respects only power and blood, Julian stepped from his armored sedan, the weight of 1,000 sins pressing down on his shoulders like a lead shroud. He was a man who had built a kingdom on the corpses of his enemies, a shadow in $1,000 suit who had long ago traded his soul for a throne of thorns. But as he stood in the biting wind, the cold didn't compare to the hollow ache of being sold out by his own blood. The world slowed as a figure emerged from the gray haze. A small girl in a simple white dress, a speck of purity in a landscape of asphalt and broken dreams. She didn't wince at the sight of the man whom the underground called the dragon. While men with scars and automatic weapons lowered their eyes when Julian spoke, this child looked directly into the abyss of his gaze and found something worth saving. "Mister," she whispered, her voice a fragile bell against the roar of the city. Julian looked down, his eyes hard and glassy, until he saw the crinkled yellow scrap of paper in her hand. It was torn and weathered, yet she pressed it into his palm with the solemnity of a priest offering a final rite. "Call her," she breathed, leaning into the shadow of his presence. "You need her." Her words were like a hammer blow to his sternum, certain, echoing, and possessed of an ancient truth. He unfolded the note, his fingers trembling, a movement his lieutenants would have mistaken for weakness but was, in truth, the first spark of life in a dead man's heart. No name was written, just a series of numbers that seemed to pulse with an invitation to a life he'd never known. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. The girl didn't blink. She studied the single tear that had begun its slow descent through the grit on his face, an unspoken confession of a man whose facade was finally crumbling into the dust. "Hi, Mama," the child replied with a knowing smile. "She helps people when everything is broken." In that moment, Julian Ha-jun, the architect of his own isolation, realized the empire he'd built was nothing more than a magnificent tomb. As the girl disappeared into the city's labyrinth, Julian stood frozen, the paper clutched in his hand like a lifeline in a storm. For the first time in 15 years, the dragon of the north didn't reach for his gun. He reached for the phone. He dialed. The rain in Seoul didn't just fall. It interrogated the pavement, washing away the superficial gloss of the city to reveal the grit beneath. Inside the hushed, obsidian glass sanctuary of his penthouse, Julian Ha-jun stood before a window that overlooked a kingdom currently cannibalizing itself. The silence of the room was a physical weight, heavier than the custom-tailored Italian wool draped over his frame. He had spent 15 years building a fortress of loyalty bought in blood, only to find that the foundations were made of sand and avarice. On the mahogany desk behind him, a tablet glowed with the cold, digital pulse of disaster. A shipment of high-end electronics, collateral for a peace treaty with the Japanese syndicates, had vanished near the Busan docks. It wasn't a heist, it was an inside job, a calculated puncture to his jugular. His second-in-command had sent a flurry of messages, each one a desperate plea for a directive that Julian was suddenly loath to give. The dragon was supposed to roar, to demand a tithe of bone and repentance, yet all Julian felt was a bone-deep weariness that no amount of power could anesthetize. He turned away from the window, his sharp features caught in the flickering light of a dying cigar, reflecting the calculated coldness of a man who had long ago decided that emotion was a terminal liability. He thought of the men currently sitting in a basement in Incheon, waiting for his word to begin the cleansing. In the past he would have enjoyed the precision of the retaliation. Now the thought of more blood only made the metallic tang in his mouth more bitter. Julian reached into his pocket and felt the crinkled yellow scrap of paper. It felt alien against his skin, a piece of a world he didn't belong to, delivered by a child who had seen the shadows in his eyes. He was a man who ruled Chicago's underground with methodical precision, yet he was being unmade by a 7-digit number scrawled by a stranger. The phone on his desk buzzed. Another update on the betrayal. A name had surfaced. Min-ho, a man Julian had treated like a brother. The betrayal wasn't just a business loss. It was a total collapse of the only reality he understood. Julian looked at the phone, then at the yellow paper. The crown he wore was a circle of fire, and for the first time he realized that the only way to stop the burning was to let the entire empire turn to ash. He sat in the dark, a king of shadows, finally understanding that being untouchable was just a more expensive way of being utterly alone. The heavy door of the armored sedan closed with a thud that sounded like a lid on a casket. Julian Ha-jun stood on the rain-slicked asphalt of a city that had finally traded its loyalty for a higher price, the metallic tang of betrayal still sharp on his tongue. He was the dragon, a man whose very name caused the powerful to avert their gaze. Yet in this moment his empire felt like a shroud of lead. He reached for a cigarette, his fingers steady despite the phantom ache in his chest, when a soft tug at his sleeve broke the silence of the night. He looked down, his eyes hard and glassy, expecting a threat or a plea for mercy. Instead he found a child no older than 5, standing in a simple white dress that seemed to glow against the grime of the street. She didn't quail. While grown men with scars and automatic weapons trembled in his presence, this little girl looked directly into his soul with a clarity that unsettled him more than a rival's blade. She held out a small, crinkled scrap of yellow paper, her expression earnest and eerily calm. "Mister," she whispered, her voice a fragile bell against the distant roar of Chicago's traffic. Julian hesitated, his mind still racing with the logistics of retaliation, but the girl pressed the paper into his palm with the solemnity of a final rite. As she leaned closer, the scent of rain and innocent hope cut through the smell of expensive tobacco and cold steel. "Call her," she breathed, her words a secret meant only for a man who had forgotten the sound of a kind voice. "You need her. She helps people when everything is broken." Julian frowned, his thumb brushing the handwritten digits. He had spent 15 years building a world where trust was a fairy tale told to fools, yet this child spoke with a certainty that felt like fate itself. He looked back at her, searching for the catch, the hidden motive, but found only a knowing smile. For the first time in a decade, the feared boss felt the armor around his heart crack. Before he could ask why she had chosen him, she stepped back into the shadows and vanished into the labyrinth of the city. Standing alone in the cold, Julian clutched the paper like a lifeline, the weight of the crown finally becoming too much to bear. Slowly, his hand trembling with a raw vulnerability he thought he had buried at 12, he pulled out his phone and dialed. The elevator ride to the top of the Gold Coast penthouse was a silent ascent into a tomb of glass and polished marble. Julian Ha-jun stood mirrored in the stainless steel, a man who commanded Chicago's underground with methodical precision, yet he looked like a specter haunted by a 5-year-old's whisper. He stepped into the sprawling living space where the city lights twinkled below, mocking his isolation. Usually this view felt like a conquest. Tonight, it felt like a surveillance feed of a kingdom he no longer recognized. He shed his black wool coat, the custom-tailored Italian fabric feeling like a lead shroud. On the mahogany desk, his phone pulsed with the frantic energy of a collapsing empire. Messages from his most trusted lieutenants detailed the rot. A shipment lost at the docks, a territory dispute in Lincoln Park, and a rival family moving like wolves in the night. Any other night, Julian would have met this chaos with a calculated coldness, a black dragon ready to burn the dissenters. But as he poured a glass of amber liquid, his hand did not reach for the encrypted phone. Instead, he pulled the crinkled yellow scrap of paper from his pocket. He sat in the heavy silence of the penthouse, unable to stop thinking about the girl's eyes. She hadn't looked at him with the fear that usually greeted a man of his reputation. She had looked at him with a terrifying certainty, as if she knew his carefully constructed walls were already dust. "You need her," she had said, and the words felt like a prophecy aimed directly at the exhaustion he could no longer hide. He was a man who had built a life on the belief that emotion was a liability and trust was a fairy tale, yet he felt himself shattering under the weight of an innocent's compassion. He stared at the handwritten digits, his thumb tracing the rough edge of the paper. Outside, the snow began to fall again, blanketing the city in a deceptive peace that he knew was a lie. He was the dragon, a second-generation boss who had expanded his father's ambitions beyond imagination. But in the hollow center of his gold-plated world, he was utterly alone. The betrayal from his own ranks stung, but the girl's kindness hurt worse. He stood at the precipice of his own broken empire, realizing that for the first time in 15 years, he didn't want to fight for a throne. He wanted to be helped. Slowly, with a raw vulnerability that made him look years younger, Julian Ha-jun picked up his phone and dialed. The silence in the penthouse was a marauder, thick and suffocating, as Julian Ha-jun stared at the handwritten digits that felt like a rough piece of glass in his soul. Outside, Chicago was a wasteland of freezing shadows and deceptive peace, a city that had finally traded its loyalty for a price Julian could no longer pay. He was a man who had inherited an organization built on blood and expanded it beyond his father's wildest ambitions, yet he stood in his high-end sanctuary feeling the crushing weight of a crown made of thorns. The betrayal from his own ranks was a puncture to his jugular, but the 5-year-old girl's whisper, "You need her," was the blow that had actually unmade him. He poured another glass of amber liquid, his hand trembling with a raw vulnerability he hadn't felt since his mother's funeral when he was 12. He was the dragon, a man whose sharp features held the calculated coldness of a killer, yet he was being dismantled by a crinkled scrap of yellow paper. With a heavy breath that hitched in his chest, he finally picked up the phone. He didn't check the messages detailing his crumbling empire. He dialed the 7 digits with the solemnity of a man stepping into his own execution. The line clicked open and the world seemed to stop its frantic rotation. "Hello." The voice was rich and warm, touched with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying the world on your shoulders while pretending the weight doesn't hurt. It wasn't the voice of a subordinate or a rival. It was a sound that radiated the kind of warmth Julian had forgotten existed in a world where loyalty was bought in blood. A little girl gave me this number," Julian managed, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man desperately trying to control every syllable. "She said everything was breaking." There was a pause, a moment of profound recognition that bypassed the thousands of dollars of Italian fabric and the black dragon curling up his neck. "Then you must be the one she saw," Thelma Williams replied, her tone shifting into a gentle firmness that offered a truth Julian was terrified to hear. "My daughter doesn't give that out to people who still have their armor on." Julian closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cold glass of the window. For 15 years he had been untouchable, convinced that isolation was his greatest strength. But as he listened to the steady, uncomplicated kindness in her voice, the dragon finally realized he was tired of being a shadow in his own kingdom. "I don't know who I am anymore," he whispered into the dark, and for the first time in his life he wasn't running from the truth. The engine of the armored sedan cut out, leaving Julian Ha-jun in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical blow. He stepped out into the biting air of the south side, his custom-tailored Italian wool coat a black stain against the gray, weathered neighborhood. For 15 years he had moved through worlds where power was measured in caliber and fear, but as he walked toward the address Thelma Williams had given him, the dragon felt his skin crawling with a raw vulnerability. He was a man who ruled Chicago's underground with methodical precision, yet he felt like a ghost haunting a life he didn't deserve to touch. He found her not in a boardroom or a penthouse, but in a small lived-in apartment that smelled of cinnamon and bone-deep weariness. Thelma emerged from the kitchen, her dark brown skin glowing in the soft, golden light of a home held together by grit and prayer. She didn't offer a bow or a diverted gaze. She looked at Julian with the sharp awareness of someone who had learned to read danger long before it struck. She wore her exhaustion like armor, a practical bun holding back curls that framed features shadowed by the kind of struggle Julian's money could never anesthetize. Julian stood in the center of her small living room, his expensive watch checking time that held no meaning in a place where every dollar was a calculated victory of the soul. He looked at the modest pile of used books and worn crayons on the table, realizing that his entire empire was a hollow tomb compared to the miracle of the peace radiating from this woman. He had spent his life convinced that isolation equaled strength, but watching Thelma move with the fierce determination to be enough for her daughter, Julian felt the pillars of his world turning to ash. "You look like a man waiting for a sentence," Thelma said, her voice rich and warm, touched with the wisdom of someone who had done her own share of running. Julian reached for his wallet, a reflex born of a world where everything had a price, but his hand froze. He realized with a crushing weight in his chest that his billions were worthless here. He didn't want to buy her loyalty, he wanted to borrow her courage. For the first time, the feared boss understood that true power wasn't the ability to destroy, it was the strength to remain soft in a world that demanded you be made of stone. He sat on her worn sofa, a king of shadows finally admitting that he was utterly alone. Thelma Moore stood in the center of her small kitchen, her dark brown skin glowing in the cafe's golden light, her gaze flickering over Julian with the sharp awareness of someone who had learned to read danger before it struck. She saw the expensive coat and the confident posture of a man who radiated danger the way most people radiated warmth. A man who possessed the particular flatness of someone carefully controlling every syllable. To any other observer, he was a notorious boss who ruled his empire with an iron fist, his sharp features holding the calculated coldness of someone who believed emotion was a liability. But Thelma's instincts were finely tuned by the particular exhaustion that came from carrying the world on her shoulders, and she saw the murky this night had summoned for him. Beneath the designer clothes and the $1,000 watch that checked time with no meaning, she recognized the bone-deep weariness of a man fighting battles no one else could see. She watched him sit perfectly still, his coffee growing cold between his palms as he stared into the black liquid as if it held the answers to questions he'd stopped asking. While the world saw a black dragon in traditional ink marking him as belonging to a world of blood and bought loyalty, Thelma saw the cracks in his armor. She saw a man wrapped in isolation of his own making, a man who had forgotten that being untouchable meant being utterly alone. She didn't need to know what he was running from to understand that he was sitting in her cafe on Christmas Eve seeking a sanctuary from the world's noise. Though she warned him that her daughter was off limits, she couldn't ignore the raw vulnerability that flickered in his dark eyes when Nia spoke to him. He looked at the child like she was something precious and fragile, something he wanted to protect but didn't know how. In the set of his shoulders, Thelma recognized a different mask for grief and loneliness, the kind that made his hands tremble with a reaction he couldn't afford to show his lieutenants. She realized that this man, who commanded the underground with methodical precision, was truly broken inside, his carefully constructed walls unable to withstand the determined assault of innocent compassion. He wasn't just a monster to be feared. He was a soul seeking redemption in the most unexpected package. While Julian Ha-jun sat in the golden cinnamon-scented glow of Thelma's world, the cold machinery of his own empire continued to grind in the darkness. On the frost-rimmed streets of Chicago, where loyalty was bought in blood and trust was a fairy tale told to fools, eyes that had seen things leaving permanent shadows were watching. His second-in-command, Jin, moved through the city's Korean underground with methodical precision, his phone buzzing with the frantic, insistent energy of a kingdom under siege. But Jin wasn't the only one tracking the dragon's movements. The Volkov family, a rival organization that sought comfort in the vices Julian provided, had begun to notice the subtle shift in the city's power dynamics. They were wolves in the night, expanding into residential zones like Englewood, putting pressure on the world to sell out its last shred of peace. For 15 years, Julian had built walls and constructed defenses to ensure he remained untouchable, but his calculated solitude had finally cracked. The Volkov lieutenants didn't see a man seeking redemption. They saw a notorious boss wasting time in sentiment, a weakness they intended to exploit with calculated violence. They began to file away details, categorizing the Rising Star Cafe not as a sanctuary, but as a target. They watched the sleek black sedan, a vehicle completely out of place in a working-class neighborhood, wait until a woman and a child were safely inside. To the Volkovs, Thelma and Nia were no longer civilians. They were a complication, a contamination of the business of blood. They saw a man who had inherited his father's ambitions and expanded them beyond imagination now lingering in a corner booth, staring at Dusky while his empire bled. As the snow fell heavier, coating the streets in a treacherous, deceptive white, the shadows in the background began to crystallize into a threat Julian hadn't yet articulated. He had ordered a passive watch, a quiet protection that he hoped would remain invisible, but the world he belonged to didn't allow for secrets. While Nia colored stick figures beneath a smiling sun, unaware of the danger her mother's neighborhood had seen in years, the Volkovs were already preparing their determined assault. The dragon's armor was dismantled, and in the cold, calculated world of the Chicago underground, an obsession was just another word for a liability that got you killed. The heater in the small apartment hummed against the Chicago winter, a mechanical heartbeat in a room that finally felt like a sanctuary. Julian Ha-jun sat on the edge of the worn sofa, his $1,000 suit a dark, sharp contrast to the warmth of the living room. Across from him, Nia sat with her coloring books, her hair pulled into 2 puffs secured with red ribbons, looking at him with a clarity that dismantled 15 years of carefully constructed walls. The Dragon of the North, a man who ruled an empire with an iron fist, felt his chest tighten as the child studied the shadows in his eyes. Shadows he'd spent a lifetime trying to hide. "Why me, Nia?" Julian asked, his voice carrying the gravelly rasp of a man who hadn't spoken an honest word in years. "Why did you give me that paper?" The little girl didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head, her brown eyes holding the particular intensity of someone who hadn't yet learned that the world demanded you hide your heart. She reached out, her small hand taking his much larger one, a natural, guileless gesture that offered a kind of courage Julian had never possessed. "Because you looked like the shadows were winning," she said softly, her voice possessing an old soul wisdom that bypassed his calculated coldness. "Mama says tears are just feelings that overflow when we try to keep them all inside. She says it's braver to let them out than to pretend they don't exist." Julian froze, the realization settling in his chest with unexpected weight. He had spent a decade convinced that isolation equaled strength and that mercy was a liability that got you killed. Yet this 7-year-old girl living in Englewood and taking buses in snowstorms was teaching him that his armor was actually a prison. "I saw you listen," Nia continued, a small, knowing smile crossing her face. "Most grown-ups just hear the noise, but you listen to the quiet parts. That's how I knew you needed her." In the flickering light of the apartment, Julian looked at the child and saw a miracle worth more than any empire he could build. Her easy trust was something he hadn't earned, yet she offered it without conditions or judgment. He realized then that he wasn't just a boss protecting civilians. He was a man being rescued by the determined assault of innocent compassion. The dragon's mask had completely disintegrated, replaced by a raw vulnerability that made him look human for the first time since his mother's funeral. He squeezed her hand back, finally accepting the gift of being seen. The dragon's roar was silent now, channeled into the cold, methodical precision of a man who had finally found something worth the weight of his iron fist. Julian Ha-jun stood in the flickering shadows of his penthouse, his custom-tailored Italian wool coat feeling like a lead shroud as he stared at the city's gray, weathered skyline. He had spent 15 years building walls and constructing defenses, convinced that isolation equaled strength and that detachment equaled survival. But one 7-year-old girl had demolished those convictions in under an hour, and now the fierce protectiveness that had awakened when Nia fell was the only law he respected. He pulled out his phone, not to check the frantic messages from a crumbling empire, but to summon Jin, his most trusted lieutenant. "I want that building and the surrounding block under passive watch," Julian ordered, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man who didn't invite argument. "Nothing obvious. I don't want them knowing, but if the Volkovs make any moves, I want to know immediately." Jin's tone suggested a question, why they were protecting civilians in Englewood, but Julian's voice held finality. "No. You shouldn't." The arrangements took 10 minutes, but the invisible hand of the dragon moved with an efficiency that suggested resources and influence Thelma Moore couldn't match. He arranged for a regular car service, telling the manager to make it look like a holiday promotion so it wouldn't frighten them, ensuring they weren't taking buses in snowstorms ever again. He reached out to a landlord citing a clerical error to suddenly reduce their rent, and manipulated a cafe manager into giving Thelma a raise she had long ago earned. Julian watched from the darkness of his armored sedan as the shadows in the background began to crystallize into a shield. He was a man who destroyed things, who had learned at his father's knee that mercy was weakness, yet he was now using his empire to protect a miracle he didn't even know how to touch. He didn't demand acknowledgement or gratitude. He just helped quietly, efficiently, without fanfare or expectation. As the snow blanketing the city brought a deceptive peace, Julian Ha-jun stood alone, finally understanding that true power wasn't the ability to kill. It was the strength to ensure that a child's innocent compassion remained full of light in a world this cruel. The blizzard returned to Chicago with a vengeful howl, turning the glass walls of Julian Ha-jun's penthouse into a blurred white cage. Inside, the dragon was bleeding. A coordinated strike by the Volkov family had dismantled 3 of his key transit hubs in an hour, but the physical loss was nothing compared to the internal collapse. Julian stood in the center of his vast dark living room, the encrypted phone in his hand slick with the sweat of a man who had finally reached the limit of his own iron fist. For 15 years he had believed that isolation equaled strength, but as his empire crumbled, he realized he was merely a king of ashes, untouchable and utterly alone. He didn't call Jin for a retaliation strike. Instead, he found himself driving through the treacherous, deceptive piece of the snow toward the only light that didn't feel like a predatory neon glare. When he reached the apartment in Englewood, his custom-tailored coat was heavy with melting ice, and his sharp features were shadowed by a bone-deep weariness he could no longer hide. He knocked on the door at an hour that mocked his own methodical precision. Thelma opened the door, her dark brown skin glowing in the soft, golden light of a home that smelled of cinnamon and quiet resilience. She didn't see the feared boss or the black dragon tattoo curling up his neck. She saw a man whose carefully constructed walls had finally turned to dust. Julian stood in her doorway, his hands trembling. A reaction that would have signaled his death in the underground, but here was simply a confession of his humanity. "Everything is breaking," he managed, his voice a gravelly rasp that carried the weight of 1,000 hard choices. Thelma didn't ask about the Volkovs or the betrayal. She reached out and pulled the feared dragon into the warmth of her kitchen, her touch firm and uncomplicated. In the silence of that small room, Julian Ha-jun, a man who had been trained to believe that emotion was a liability, finally collapsed into the chair. He didn't offer money or power. He simply leaned into the strength of a woman who knew that being seen was the only true sanctuary. As the storm raged outside, the dragon realized that his billions couldn't buy the peace Thelma possessed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the protector. He was the one being saved by a mother's fierce determination to remain soft in a world this cruel. The deceptive peace of the Chicago snowfall finally shattered, leaving a trail of rough glass and cold calculation in its wake. Julian Ha-jun stood in the flickering shadows of his penthouse, his custom-tailored Italian wool coat feeling like a lead shroud as the digital pulse of disaster vibrated in his palm. The Volkov family, those wolves in the night who sought comfort in the vices Julian provided, had finally connected the dots. They didn't see a notorious boss seeking redemption. They saw a weakness to be exploited with methodical precision. The passive watch Julian had ordered was no longer invisible. The secret of the Rising Star Cafe was out. In Englewood, the gray morning light filtered through the windows of the small apartment where Thelma Moore was brewing coffee, unaware that the world's noise was closing in. Julian's past, a black dragon curling up his neck and marking him as belonging to a world of blood, had followed him into this sanctuary. The Volkovs had shifted their focus from contested residential territory to a much more valuable target, the woman and child who had dismantled the dragon's armor. As the snow fell heavier, coating the streets in a treacherous white, the invisible hand Julian used to protect them was suddenly forced into the light. Julian didn't wait for his lieutenants to handle the routine business of war. He moved with the raw vulnerability of a man who had everything to lose, his sharp features holding a calculated coldness that was now directed at the shadows threatening his new family. He had spent 15 years convinced that isolation equaled strength, but as he raced toward Englewood, he realized that the stakes had changed. It wasn't about the empire anymore. It was about the 7-year-old girl with ribbons in her hair and the mother whose fierce determination had given him a reason to believe in goodness again. The crosshairs of a ruthless enemy were now locked on the only people who had ever truly seen him, and the dragon knew that mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford. The battle for redemption was about to become a war for survival, and the most unexpected package was now the most dangerous liability in the city. The engine of the armored sedan was a low, voracious thrum against the suffocating silence of the Englewood night. Julian Ha-jun sat in the dark, his fingers tracing the cold steel of the handgun at his hip while the crinkled yellow paper remained tucked against his heart. Outside, the snow fell like ash over a dying kingdom. The Volkov wolves were no longer in the shadows. They were at the throat of the only sanctuary he had ever known. He looked at the window of the small apartment where the golden light of Thelma's world flickered, unaware that the black dragon on his neck had brought a death sentence to her door. The weight of the crown had never felt more like a lead shroud. Julian knew the mathematics of his world. His presence was a contamination. If he fled, if he vanished back into the glass towers of the Gold Coast and cut every tie, the Volkovs might lose interest, leaving Thelma and Nia to return to their quiet, difficult peace. But the memory of Nia's small hand in his, of her whispering that he was the one who listened, anchored him to the spot. To run was to leave them defenseless against an escalation he had triggered. To stay was to turn their home into a battlefield. He closed his eyes, leaning his head against the cold leather of the seat, caught between the calculated coldness of the boss and the raw vulnerability of the man. He had spent 15 years convinced that isolation equaled strength, but as he watched a shadow move across Thelma's curtain, he realized that a throne built on fear was just a high-priced coffin. The betrayal of his empire had stripped him of his power, but the thought of Nia losing her light stripped him of his soul. He reached for the door handle, his jaw clenching with the fierce protectiveness of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't be a shadow in their lives any longer. If the world demanded blood for the sin of his redemption, he would pay it in full, but he would not let the darkness touch the child who had offered to share her mother with a stranger. The dragon stepped out into the biting wind, his shadow long and rough against the snow, choosing to stand as the shield between the wolves and the miracle. He walked toward the light, finally understanding that the bravest thing he could ever do was refuse to be untouchable. Inside the quiet apartment, the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and the heavy, metallic tang of Julian's fading world. Julian Ha-jun sat in the center of the small living room, his custom-tailored Italian wool coat discarded like a lead shroud on the floor, his sharp features now a map of raw vulnerability. The Dragon of the North, a man who had built a kingdom on the belief that emotion was a liability, found his chest hitching with the quiet certainty of ice cracking beneath spring's first warmth. He was a man who destroyed things, but as he looked at Thelma he realized he was the one currently in pieces. Thelma didn't offer the polite dismissal he was used to from the world he ruled with an iron fist. Instead she emerged from the kitchen, her dark brown skin glowing in the soft golden light, her eyes holding the particular wisdom of someone who had done her own share of running. She didn't ask Julian for a confession or a list of his sins. She simply saw the bone-deep weariness shadowed on his face and the permanent shadows left by the things he had seen. She moved toward him, her natural hair framing features that remained stunning despite the weight she carried on her own shoulders. "You're not running from anything, Julian," she said softly, her voice rich and warm, touched with an exhaustion that didn't hurt quite as much when shared. "You're just finally arriving." She reached out, her hands moving through the familiar motions of comfort, placing a simple white mug of coffee between his trembling palms. It wasn't the thousands of dollars in his bank account that anchored him. It was the fierce determination in her gaze to be enough for a man the world considered a monster. For 15 years, Julian had convinced himself that isolation equaled strength, but as Thelma sat across from him he felt the first crack in his armor turn into a total collapse. She stayed with him as the shadows of his past hovered at the door, proving that her daughter's whisper was a prophecy. Thelma more truly helped people when everything was broken, not with a rival's bullet or a detective's investigation, but with the determined assault of innocent compassion and a mother's fierce protection. Julian leaned into the silence, his jaw clenching as he accepted the gift of being seen for the first time since he was 12. In that small Englewood apartment, the feared boss finally understood that some connections, once made, proved stronger than all the reasons to stay apart. 6 months later, the Chicago summer arrived not with the deceptive peace of a blizzard, but with a sun bright enough to shame the shadows of 1,000 sins. The Dragon of the North stood in the private garden of a Gold Coast penthouse, his custom-tailored Italian wool replaced by a linen shirt that felt light, as if the lead shroud he had worn for 15 years had finally been burned away by the light. He moved no longer like a beast seeking solitude, but like a man who had found redemption in the last place he expected. Julian watched Nia run across the grass in a birthday dress she had chosen herself, her laughter a miracle worth more than any empire built on fear and calculated violence. He remembered the night she had offered to let him borrow her mother, an invitation so completely impossible it had shattered the walls he thought were armored against the world's noise. Now, as she waved enthusiastically at him, Julian waved back, his sharp features finally holding something soft and unguarded. Thelma appeared at his elbow, her dark brown skin glowing in the summer heat, her presence an anchor that Julian no longer fought to resist. She leaned into his shoulder, a gesture earned through countless conversations and the slow, painful building of trust. Julian's arm settled around her waist, the black dragon tattoo on his neck still visible above his collar, a mark of a world where loyalty was bought in blood, but one he no longer tried to hide. He had been brutally honest about the empire he had inherited and the activities that existed in moral darkness, expecting her to run. Instead she had seen the broken man beneath the mask and chose to stay. In this new empire, power was not measured in territory or protection bought through intimidation, but in the quiet certainty of belonging. Julian had learned that the bravest thing a man could do was accept the gift of being seen and to remain soft in a world that demanded hardness. He would never be perfect, and the dusky of his past would always carry shadows, but he had found a different kind of strength. As Nia pulled him toward the birthday cake, Julian Ha-jun realized that family was something you built from fractured pieces, and that sometimes the best gifts arrived wrapped in the most unexpected packages. He was no longer untouchable, and for the first time in his life he wasn't utterly alone.